The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for gaining wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for receiving instruction in prudent behavior, doing what is right and just and fair, for giving prudence to those who are simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. For understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Proverbs 1, verses 1 through 7. The word of the Lord.
Hey, a few weeks ago, we actually had concluded this sermon series in the book of James, and James was actually written by the brother of Jesus. And one of the things that I had mentioned about the book of James is that it's actually stationed within this broader tradition called the wisdom tradition. And the reason why the book of James is considered part of the wisdom tradition is because the book of James has so many practical teachings about a wise way to live. And the reality is, whether you're a Christian or you're not, you could be religious or irreligious, there's something about wisdom that it speaks to us all. There's a truth that governs us all. And in many ways, the book of James was emblematic of that. Now, what was so unique about James was that he was writing as someone who's a brother of Jesus and one of the early leaders of the church. And so whether you're a Christian or you're not, hopefully when you were part of that message series, you were thinking, wow, that makes a lot of sense. I may not believe it, but I can actually see why that way of living may be a good way of living. Now, the wisdom tradition actually goes back even centuries before that. And especially in the Judeo-Christian faith, what actually has shaped the wisdom tradition is actually the book of Proverbs. Now, the book of Proverbs and the passage that was just read for us by Chacha, over the next 3 weeks, we're going to be looking at various passages in the book of Proverbs, investigating these ideas of what does wisdom look like from a Judeo-Christian perspective. Now, here's the thing, again, for wisdom, you don't even have to share the same faith tradition. Hopefully what you'll do is you'll hear some of these teachings and be like, you know what, at the very least, that sounds like a good way to live. Now notice, here's what Solomon writes as we jump right in, because Solomon is setting the stage for what does the wisdom tradition look like? What does it mean to be truly wise? And notice, it says the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. If you're to look at the history of King Solomon, he was someone who had extraordinary amounts of wisdom. And so he writes as someone who's beginning to teach what wisdom truly looks like. Now notice what he writes. He says, for gaining wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for receiving instruction in prudent behavior, doing what is right and just and fair, for giving prudence to those who are simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. For understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Now, what Solomon is doing, he's setting the stage for what is the posture of what a wise life truly looks like. Now, first, there's this Hebrew word for wisdom, and it's the word chokmah. Can I hear you say chokmah? High five your neighbor and ask them, do you have chokmah? That's right. Do you have chokmah? Do you have some wisdom here? Now, here's the thing about wisdom, right? Like today, many of us might equate this idea of wisdom with knowledge. Like the more we know about something, the more degrees you have about something, then that person is truly wise. But actually, this word chokmah is a word that it means skill or applied knowledge. So for instance, in the book of Exodus, this word chokmah is actually used to describe artisans and builders. So in other words, artisans and builders have chokmah because what they've done is they've taken knowledge and they've begun to apply it in their lives in winsome ways. And in the same way, this is what wisdom is. Wisdom is not just simply these ethereal ideas that we talk about around a campfire. It's basically something that begins to inform the way that I go about my world. What is it that governs my life and begins to shape the way that I live and move and inhabit the world? Now, notice there were two words that were underlined that I wanted to bring attention to, because again, Solomon's bringing about what is the posture of what wisdom looks like. And now notice he uses words like receiving instruction. And notice what he writes. He says, let the wise listen. High five your neighbor and say, listen. That's right. And add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. High five your other neighbor and say, get guidance. That's right. Some of you were high-fiving with some force there. Maybe subliminal messages or not so subliminal messages to your neighbor. But notice, in both of these descriptions, to listen and to get guidance, there's a certain posture that's associated with that. It's a posture of someone who's willing to learn. In other words, having the mentality of a learner, that you're willing to get guidance, that you're willing to listen to the Proverbs. And so at the very beginning of the book of Proverbs, what Solomon is saying is the posture of what wisdom looks like is someone who has the disposition of a learner. In other words, someone who has a growth mindset. I'm continually learning and growing and being shaped and looking for growing in this thing we call wisdom. Now, this is really difficult to have, especially if you're someone who's really smart and you know it all and you've got multiple degrees and you figured it out and you make a lot of money and you've got a lot of friends that also have done the same. In other words, I'm talking to you all and to me here in the city. I mean, this is what it means to be a New Yorker, is that we are the best and the brightest. But now here's the thing. What happens though is this idea of us being the best and the brightest, this is probably the only place in the world where I could say that with a straight face and yeah. Right, but I mean, this is who we are as New Yorkers. But notice, like even Solomon, who's so learned and so skilled in this area of wisdom, Solomon is inviting people. He's saying the posture of wisdom is not that we each are know-it-alls that are the best and the brightest, and therefore we don't need help from anyone because of Google and AI and whatever else. Instead, what it means to be wise is to actually have a posture in which I'm listening, I'm learning. That despite whatever age or background I come from, I can learn from anyone. One of the illustrations that I often use in our marriage context is our church, hopefully is caring deeply about marriages and wants to invest deeply in marriages. And a lot of that is the church that I used to be part of in Queens had a very strong emphasis in healthy relationships. And so I was actually trained in coaching married couples when I was in my 20s. I wasn't even married. I wasn't even dating anyone. And yet here I was, and I was coaching this couple. And so one of the first marriage workshops I remember at this church that I was at, and I share this illustration at different marriage workshops I go to. Here I was as this 20-something who was unmarried, who was now like coaching this couple in conflict. And the first couple that I was coaching, they had been married for about 30 years. So you could imagine just how ridiculous this looked, right? Here I was, and I'm sitting with them, and I'm walking them through this conflict that they're discussing, and every once in a while I'm interrupting them. I'm like, oh, I think you could phrase that differently, or oh, I think that word might be a bit triggering. Maybe you could use a different word there. So here I am, I'm coaching them, and I could see and I could feel this growing tension and animosity amongst this couple, especially towards me. Finally, like the husband, he gets so frustrated, and then he goes, like after I interrupt him, he goes, you would think that I would know this by now. And I was like, seriously? No, I'm just kidding. I didn't say that. That's not a good coach. I was like, I was so humbled, and I just basically said, I was like, sir, I recognize how silly this looks because I'm not even married, and you guys have been married for 30 years. Clearly, you're doing something right, and I have no idea what I'm talking about. But I said, in many ways, I hope that if and when I ever get married, that 30 years into my marriage, that I'm willing to show up at marriage workshops like these and be able to learn and grow in how to better love my wife. You guys are such an example for me of someone who's constantly willing to grow and work on your marriage. So thank you for the honor and the privilege for being able to listen to you and to work with you right now. He was like, fine. But in many ways, I remember just that moment, and I recognized, like, for my own marriage, like, I hope that I could always have that kind of posture, a posture where I'm willing to learn and grow, and where I'm willing to listen and get guidance. But there's something inside of us, though. There's this pride that emanates, and what Solomon is getting at, he's saying, wherever that pride comes from, where you're not willing to listen and get guidance, then something has gone awry if you're not willing to admit that you can always be growing. Now, Liz Wiseman, who's a business management guru, she wrote this book called Rookie Smarts, Why Learning Beats Knowing in the New Game of Work. And she talks about so many of the innovations that happen in the world today, and especially when it comes to business management. She talks about how the best workers and the best leaders are those who are constantly growing. Now, here are some quotes that she writes. She says, what we know might actually mask what we don't know and impede our ability to learn and perform. In other words, what we know that kind of life works a certain way, and this is the best way to do things. But that might be the greatest hindrance for us to actually learn new skills. And what she contends and what she invites people to do is to continue to be a rookie, to continue to learn. Here's what she writes. She writes, rookie smarts isn't an age or an experience level. It is a state of mind, one that is available to those willing to unlearn and relearn. It is also a choice. Now, the same is true in the spiritual journey. The moment when I think that I've got everything figured out, Jesus says, the moment you think you've found your life, you'll lose that. But the moment you've lost your life, that's when you find it. In other words, whenever I'm in a disposition where I say, Jesus, I need you. I am not the master of my own universe. I'm not the captain of my own life. You are. Now, what Solomon is basically inviting is he's saying, will you take the posture of someone who's willing to learn and even unlearn what might be keeping you from going to greater levels of maturity? You know, as I was thinking about this kind of aspect, I was thinking of one of my favorite NBA basketball players. His name is Steph Curry. And Steph Curry, I've devoured so many of the biographies about Steph, as well as watched so many videos on Steph, who was considered underrated for most of his life. And the reason why was because Steph was scrawnier and skinnier than most of the competition. He also had a baby face, and so as a result, most people just doubted him and underrated him. And so one of the stories that he tells is that in middle school, he's always been great in basketball. He's done well. And but in middle school, here's a picture of him playing one-on-one against his brother Seth. And in middle school, here he is shooting from the three-point line. Now, he was a marksman even as a middle schooler. But if you notice, one of the things is that because he was shorter and scrawnier, he couldn't shoot or generate enough power to shoot. So he has to shoot. He'd bring the ball up from his waist up to his chest, and then he'd have to shoot from his chest. And so even in the shot here, that's what he's doing. So his dad, who was an NBA player named Del Curry, his dad actually one summer basically said to him, Steph, you need to learn how to shoot from higher up so that the shot doesn't get blocked. So you have to stop shooting the way that's been working for you. And the way that Steph tells the story, he was so angry and upset. His dad pulled him out of all the leagues, so he wasn't able to play. And he spent that entire summer just shooting jump shot after jump shot with this new form that was cumbersome and difficult for him. He writes that he wanted to quit shooting. But there was something about in that moment where he was willing to listen to his dad, change his shooting form, and today he's the second best shooter of all time. Here's a picture of Steph shooting today with exquisite form. Now, some of you are like, who's the best shooter of all time? That's Jalen Brunson of the New York Knicks, everyone. So just so you know, just wanted to clarify that, you know. So just having the disposition of I'm constantly learning and willing to unlearn and grow. And see, this is what wisdom looks like. And this is what Solomon is pointing out. Now, here's the thing though, right? When it comes to life, most of us, like I said, if you're educated, you're smart enough, and most of us think we've got life figured out. But the reality is, I mean, human beings, there's this conundrum that most of us face in life. And it's this puzzle that so many of us who can be so smart and educated, and yet in many areas of life, we just don't have it figured out when it comes to the areas of relationship or work or money or whatever it might be. And so as a result, what ends up happening is we are full of paradoxes as human beings. We live as people that aspire to be wise, but there are so many different directions and people and places that we go to looking for what true wisdom looks like. As I was reading this article by David Benner on the topic of wisdom, check out this observation he makes when he writes about something he heard about the Dalai Lama. He wrote, He writes, the Dalai Lama was once asked what most surprised him about humans. As the story goes, he answered that humans sacrifice their health in order to make money. Then they sacrifice money to recuperate their health. Then they are so anxious about their future that they do not enjoy or truly live in the present. Then they live as if they are never going to die and die having never really lived. Can I get an amen, somebody? I mean, isn't this so true of the human dilemma? Now, here's the thing about wisdom, though. Some of you are like, that's the Dalai Lama, though. Why would you point? Well, the Dalai Lama, again, wisdom, it speaks to all of us. And the Dalai Lama is simply pointing out, whatever religious disposition we come from, we all know that the human condition is fraught with all sorts of paradoxes and ways in which our own pride, our own ways and manners of living get in the way for us living the kind of flourishing life that we all want and that we all aspire to. Now, the Dalai Lama excels in teaching us about the human dilemma and the paradox that we find ourselves in as human beings. Well, what then is the answer to a truly wise life? See, this is where Solomon is stationing the posture of wisdom is one in which I'm willing to listen and I'm willing to get guidance. But notice how Solomon concludes the introduction. Look at what he says. He says, wisdom, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. See, this statement is what Solomon's going to come back to again and again. That what stations the wisdom from a Judeo-Christian principle over and against other kinds of philosophies and manners of approaching the world is the fear of the Lord. Is that we're willing to surrender, willing to be a listener, that we're willing to get guidance, but we're willing to do so from a supreme authority that transcends us, that we truly believe that the fear of the Lord. Now, this idea of fear, it's not like terror or being scared of anything or anyone. This word fear is actually a word that really means reverence or awe. That the one that we give and surrender authority to in our lives is the Lord. It's not to any person or any media company or whatever else it might be, but that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Now, here's the idea, because again, in life, there's so many voices, so many governing ideas that tell you and me what's important, where to spend our time, our money, our energy. And here's what Solomon is saying. No, don't you see what true wisdom looks like? Is submitting to a fear that is greater than all of these voices. Now, if I were to categorize two different kind of sources of authorities in our life, things that begin to govern the way that we think and behave, I would probably categorize them as traditional cultures as well as modern cultures. Now, traditional cultures tend to have a collectivist spirit, that thinking and believing, but behaving so as not to bring shame to the collective. So for instance, I grew up in a Korean American household, and so we very much valued this whole collectivist spirit, like living for the honor of my parents. And constantly my dad would say, for the Hyun family generation, the Hyun family legacy, he would talk about that repeatedly. Now, the idea of traditional culture, some of us, we live for the collective. We live for our families. We live for our countries, for the people that we're associated with. Now, there are modern cultures, though, where the emphasis is not necessarily on the collective, but it's actually on the individual. It's on what you want and you getting to define your own way and manner of living. And so in modern cultures, this idea of being free from what other people think and living true to yourself in all of these different ways. And so as a result, what ends up happening in the world is we become a sum of so many of the different messages that we've received, whether more traditional or whether more modern, and different things that we are told to fear, in quotes, to give awe to give preeminence to in our own lives. And so as I was thinking about this, first, as this Korean American guy from like a Korean family, as first generation family was what my parents were here, and I'm a second generation. So I've been formed by this whole collectivist traditional mindset, but I've also been formed growing up in the United States, which is so much about the individual and individual expressionism. And so this modern mindset. And so I was listing out, what are some of the different fears that have governed my life? And I don't know if you would relate to any of these, but here are some of mine. Number one, the fear of my parents and family. Now again, when I talk about fear, I'm talking about what I've been shaped by, what's important, what matters most. And for me, for most of my life, it was basically, my dad would constantly tell me, for Hyun family legacy, we came here with very little money, but we came here so that you guys could go to Harvard. I know it sounds so antiquated, but I mean, that was it. It was like, that was the true north. And then I didn't get in. And so I didn't get in. So now it's like trying to find my way then to like prove myself in other ways, and so that I can bring honor, because why? The fear of my parents and family, bringing honor to their name, not bringing shame to their name. Like that's what's driven me. But do you see, this is just another form of fear, of a traditionalist mindset of fear. Number two, the fear of my boss and coworkers. Some of you today, you may be like, no, I don't fear them. But the reality is, when it comes to the way that even what you've walked into this room this morning, like you're thinking about, oh, my boss is really upset at me, or they're thinking this, or my coworkers, and as a result, again, this collectivist culture, we are most fearful of what other people think, or the fear of anyone I put in authority in quotes. Now, it could be anyone in some sort of authority, a boss, a coach, or anything. Originally, I grew up in an immigrant church context, and in this immigrant church context in Los Angeles, the pastor meant everything. And so the pastor's words and the pastor's opinions meant so much. And so honestly, I was gonna put the fear of the pastor, but I didn't want it to be so self-incriminating. So I just put the fear of authority. But some of us, I mean, this is kind of the way, like you care so deeply about what I think or what other pastors or leaders might think. And as a result, what ends up shaping or guiding the way that we move about the world is anything but the Lord. It's our family of origin. It's the family legacy. It's what our boss and our coworkers think, what our friends think, what those in authority think. But maybe it's not a traditional culture. Maybe from a modern culture, I was thinking the fear of losing control. Some of us, that's what's really governs us, the fear of losing control, because we just want to have control over things. And that's why whenever you get particle invites or paperless post invites or evite invites, you put maybe all the time. Yeah, you know who you are. Don't want to lose control. You never know. Friday night, I don't know, like maybe. I want to lose control of or better yet, you look at the invitation and you don't respond. Why? It's the fear of losing control. Or the fear of losing security, perhaps, or the fear of losing comfort. Maybe you grew up in a setting where you didn't have much comfort or much security. So as a result, when it comes to finances, you're constantly comfort and security. And the idea of losing those things is so threatening because you never want to go back to what you grew up with. And so what ends up happening is we become people who the greatest fear in our lives that governs us, that governs the way, that becomes the authority in our lives, is the fear of losing control or comfort. Or maybe it's not control or comfort. Maybe it's the fear of being a failure or labeled or called a failure. We care so deeply about what people think. We're used to being winners, people who are labeled as a success, and yet there's a fear. What if I'm a failure? And there are these wounds of when we all, or I shouldn't say we all, I should speak for myself. When I felt like a loser in middle school, felt like I didn't fit in with the in crowd. And there's a part of me still that wants to somehow prove myself. And here I am as a middle-aged man, wanting to prove to these middle school people that I don't even keep in touch with, that I've made it, I'm somebody. I mean, this is what we do. We've got this fear that governs us, a fear of failure. Or maybe it's a fear of being like everyone else. We've been told this idea that somehow you need to be unique. You need to stand out. And there's this fear that somehow I can't be like everyone else. And the question when it comes to all of these fears, whether from a traditionalist mindset or a modernist mindset, the question for you and for me is, who or what do you fear? Who or what has authority in your life? Who or what is shaping the way that you go about relationships, the way that you handle money, the way that you go about your career, the way that you show up in spaces like this? Who or what do you fear? Who or what do you give authority to in your life? Now, what Solomon's saying, like, you see, when it comes to wisdom, the posture is one who's willing to listen and to get guidance. But the greatest source, the greatest authority that we are to fear, the invitation is not to fear the collective, is not to fear kind of just whatever, how it might encumber yourself. The greatest thing to fear is the God of the universe, is the one who created all things. And the question for me and for you is, will you give God this rightful place? Because Solomon, throughout the book of Proverbs, he's saying what wisdom truly looks like is to submit and to fear the greatest authority of all. Now, I recognize some of us, immediately we chafe against that because we're like, wait a minute, no way. Why would I ever give up or surrender authority to anyone other than myself? It's one of those things about losing control, isn't it? It's the difficulty of actually surrendering. And this is why Solomon, from the very beginning of the book of Proverbs, talks about fearing God. And so as I was thinking about this myself, I mean, some of us perhaps as we've walked and navigated through life, as we've wrestled with, yes, fearing God above anyone or anything, some of us have experienced such pain though. Like I tried following God, and yet I felt like I've been in a worse place than before. And maybe, what is it about God that I could even trust? Can I even trust that this God is reliable enough? I mean, this is what we do. We become cynical. We begin to question whether that God or whether this God is worth fearing and giving authority and surrendering authority in my life to. You know, as I was thinking about my own journey, and as I was wrestling with fear myself, and I recognize that I talked about how fear is about reverence and awe, but I was thinking about what are the moments in my life that I've just been terrified, straight up scared. Like when have those moments been? And so as I was thinking and pondering this, I was actually reflecting on when I was a kid. And one of the scariest things for me has, and continues to this day, is actually the ocean. And I grew up in Los Angeles. So I just was always scared of the ocean. And a big reason why was because we went to this neighborhood pool that like cost 25 cents to go. And that's where I learned how to swim. And I remember one of the first times I ever went into the ocean. And, you know, there's the oddness of, the water is salty and it's a little bit blurrier and what's going on. But I remember just splashing around in the ocean. And I got caught in this awful riptide. And if you've ever been caught in a riptide before, the overwhelming sheer force and power of this tide just took me and swept me out into the ocean. And I remember it was one of the scariest moments of my life that has stayed with me to this day. And so you could even notice in the picture, it's kind of ominously colored because that's how I viewed the ocean. I remember thinking that I was going to drown, and I couldn't control. I was just being washed away, carried away in this tide. I remember when I finally got my head up so that I could cry for help. I couldn't get my head up high enough so that I could say anything, but I could see above, and I could see the distant shore, how far I had been washed out. And I could see all these people kind of splashing around as I'm kind of bobbing up and down along the water. Don't worry, I survived, everyone. By the way, like some of you are like, where's the story gonna go? Yeah, I survived. That's why I'm here today. Thankfully, this one kind of wave brought me back to shore. But since that day, I've just had this terror of the ocean. Just this fear. And so, Usually when I'm in the ocean, I'll only go to a place where I could stand, or at the very least, I go to where my knees, up to my knees, where the water line's at the knees. Sometimes I'll go even further, but that's only for my family. But this fear has stayed with me. The fear of being so overpowered by the ocean. And as I was thinking about that moment of fear, I was actually thinking of this story. It comes to us in the story in the life of Jesus. And look at what it says. It says, then he got into the boat. This is Jesus. And his disciples followed him. Suddenly a furious storm came up on the lake so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, saying, Lord, save us, we're going to drown. He replied, you of little faith, why are you so afraid? Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. The men were amazed and asked, what kind of man is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. In the Gospel of Mark, it's another account of this very story. And one of the clues in the Gospel of Mark that I find so funny is it says, Jesus was asleep on a pillow. It's like the writers are reflecting upon, like, there's this crazy storm. Everyone thinks they're going to die. And the brother is asleep on a pillow. Like, they want to give this little clue. That's how chill Jesus is. This riptide that washed me out to sea. There's the God of the universe. That the entire ocean is just a drop in the bucket to him. Who is this man? Even the wind and waves obey him. See, Jesus, when he comes into the world, he doesn't just demonstrate just how powerful God is. Jesus also comes into the world to demonstrate just how loving he is, how reliable he is. And Jesus comes into the world as the exact representation of God, as what it says in the scriptures. And Jesus comes into the world to lay down his life for you and for me, to show us and to demonstrate to us that there is a God who would go to any length so that you and I might be able to trust this God, to know this God, to surrender to this God, to believe that, yes, this God is great and the wind and the waves obey him, and powerful, because that's who God is. But this God is also compassionate. This God is a God of love. This God is a God who, when it comes to all your needs, the ones that continue to bring you great fear up at night, that cause you to stay up at night, or the fear that continues to haunt us at various times related to whether it's traditional cultures or modernist cultures, there's a God that is worth surrendering your life to, believing that there's a God who loves you, who cares for you, who has given his life for you. See, Jesus is wisdom personified. This is why James would write in the book of James about all these teachings were teachings that embodied who Jesus is and was and is calling us to be as the people of God. Who or what do you fear? Who or what do you give authority to? Today, what if the invitation for you, with all the voices that are out there, to center yourself in the one who even the wind and waves obey?